Okay, I'm recording now. Yeah, that should be perfectly all right.
Good.
And I will have this open so we can look at the scriptures that we bring up. I'll just go to Bible Hub. And I think there we go. Awesome. Okay, cool. So, welcome back, everybody. Last week was like the highest week. I had 20 something people that watched. That was pretty cool. So, welcome back. And today, again, my good friend Daniel Karalash is going to be joining me today, and we're going to be discussing again Christmas. And we're going to be talking specifically about what we think the Bible says about it. Last week we did mostly the historical sort of discussion and going through all of that scholarly stuff. This week we will be going through the Bible to see what God's will actually is, because we can say one thing or another about history, but it doesn't really matter if God, doesn't agree with us. So,
right. All comes back down to what the Bible says.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I guess we can just get started. Is there anything that you want to say in introduction or preparation?
Not really. I do have like a little, I guess, plan that probably would help us guide this conversation, because I mean, just like nothing will matter unless the Bible has an opinion on it or defines something. Same goes for definitions, and make sure we're talking about the same thing. People understand that we're talking about the same thing.
Mm-hmm. No, that would be good. We should define what we're talking about first. Good idea.
Right. So I think to give some people context in case they missed the wonderful session last week, which I hear is very popular. I didn't even get to watch it. Maybe I should go back and watch it and see what all the hype is about.
Well, you were there.
Yeah. Oh well, that's fantastic. So we'll have to go give a little bit of context though, linking these two discussions, because I guess it all boiled down to the idea that even if Christmas was pagan, would it matter biblically if you're celebrating it? And by pagan we kind of meant from pagan origin or has pagan practices. It doesn't mean that the current celebrations are being used to offer idol sacrifice or something like that in modern times. We all agree that there is a sort of a transition there from what it is today to what it was before. However, it doesn't mean that the practices themselves aren't pagan in nature due to their origin and specificity. So now the question is, does it really matter biblically? And that we're taking this discussion, or in which direction, if that correctly summarizes it. Do you think that's fair, Xeilias?
Yeah. I think at the end of the discussion, my main point was that historically speaking, it's difficult to build a case one way or the other. It's easy to build a case in both directions, and it's difficult to actually definitively put, let's say, one case forward as the more historically accurate one. That was more my position.
I think that's very fair. I think that saying you can build a strong case in either direction is right. And it also depends on what matters for you and what you define as pagan. Something may have been
true.
pagan before, but if it has a completely different meaning now, is it still pagan? And all of that.
Mm-hmm.
But one thing for sure is that we don't have the smoking gun at the moment to for sure definitively prove mostly of anything in history, but this particular subject does have a bit of ambiguity in either direction, but you can build a strong case either way. So now it doesn't matter. And I think what we should define first in definitions is the word pagan, because that's a there's a very big difference between the actual definition and how we use it.
My definition of pagan is anything that is essentially not Christian or not Judeo-Christian.
Yeah. So you would say Gentile and pagan is the same thing?
Yeah. I think that it was, in the early Christian world, it was basically the demarcation between those who believe and those who don't, in the same way that the Greeks had Greek and barbarian, early Christians had Christian and pagan. And then I think that the same is true for the Jews. Gentile and Jewish is that demarcation. And so it's essentially the same thing.
Yeah, it's a good thing we bring this up, because my definition of pagan is just a little bit different. It's more of the connotation that comes with the word, because there's the denotation, the connotation, the definition or denotation is exactly what you said, pretty much. It's anything that is not considered Judeo-Christian. It's something that is foreign to that faith, and essentially Gentile. And many things could fall into it. But the way that people use the word pagan, especially in a biblical discussion, is a bit different. There's that connotation that it has to do with something that is not only Gentile in nature, but has to do with Gentile or other faith practices.
It has to do with idolatry.
Kind of, yeah. It's not even directly, it doesn't always go that far to idolatry specifically, because there could be, something that was used for their gods, but is no longer used for their gods. It's just a tradition, belief, or a practice that's not directly linked to the worship of a god, but it is a practice. So that would also be considered pagan. Because when we say, if someone was to accuse you of doing pagan things, they're not talking of you driving a car or, celebrating your birthday necessarily. Most people won't think of that. They're thinking of you doing, pagan worship practices or something like that, or something specific to a worship of a deity, regardless if you're worshiping that deity.
Yeah, I can understand and see that definition being the operating definition in most discussions. So you could break that down into pagan is not necessarily anything that's not Judeo-Christian. Pagan is the practices associated with the worship of non-Judeo-Christian gods.
Yes. With a little note that it doesn't have to necessarily be directly worshiping at that time. We borrow it now. Regardless if you're worshiping, it was used for that. So I think that's probably how we talked about when we used the word pagan. Because, we would completely agree that there's so many different pagan things, exactly by the correct definition, something not Judeo-Christian, that are not even relevant to this discussion.
Right.
Flying airplanes, I don't know, you name it. They're all considered, Gentile things that are not specific to our faith. But we're not really talking about that. We're talking about specifically pagan as it would be used in a discussion like this.
Sounds good. I think when I originally said my definition, it was not necessarily that, but it was more like the practices of non-Judeo-Christian people. So it had more to do with the people. But that can be our operating definition, what the one that you brought forward, the practices associated with the worship of not God, basically.
Yeah, and you're not wrong. Like I said, that is the definition. It's just when I say it, that's what I'm talking about correctly. And most people in their, depending on which translation you use, won't even find the word pagan in the Bible. It's kind of funny. You do a search and you're like, there's nothing pagan in the Bible. How can we even talk about this discussion? And so, yeah, it would be replaced by heathen, um, uh, Gentile, stuff like
Yeah,
that. Worship.
Gentile is a big one, or the nations that you go to dispossess.
Yeah, nations in general, uh, or world. Sometimes world would be
Mm.
used in that context. Separate yourself from the world, or worldly practices, beliefs, mentalities. Although that's already starting to get little bit further from what uh, from our the definition.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. So then we have the definition of pagan down. Did you want to define anything else?
Let me get rid of this cat here. Just throwing stuff off my desk. So, something else. Let me think. Worship. We have to define worship, just because there'll be those people that are like, well, actually, out there. So,
Mm-hmm.
worship, we really do mean in the way that you would understand worship as being in a general use of the word. Everything can be on the extreme a form of worship. You know,
Mm-hmm.
working for your boss's worship. You'd always see those different sermons
Yeah.
and stuff.
So we would say specifically ritual or ceremony.
Yeah, ritualistic, ceremonial. Um, it has to be. When I say worship, it is using specifically something that's dedicated to honor a deity. Um, so superstition would not be part of worship, although um, superstition is also relevant to this discussion. When if Gentiles have certain superstitions or practices, they're not necessarily worship; they would be considered pagan practices in general.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I would think. Would you would agree with that, right? On how you would understand it.
I I guess it would depend on the superstition. I think that they're in general wrong or bad, but I think Christians did come up with some of their own sort of superstitions that were based on some sort of false reading of scripture through history, and so I think that one would depend. But regardless, they're wrong.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good note there. Um, so with that said, that does narrow that discussion down considerably. Um, and then the question, I guess, becomes biblically, what would be considered pagan? And you can have a whack at that.
You mean the pagan worship that we're talking about now?
Yeah, when you're saying something is pagan, how would the Bible describe that? And I don't mean, the broad definition. I'm talking about with the connotation.
Well, I think it would go. Um, I think it would generally be associated with Deuteronomy 12 that we tried to have a discussion about before, but then I forgot to record it. So
Yeah, forever to be lost. We'll bring it up again
yeah,
today.
yeah, that would be the one place that I would think we could look. Another place would be, I think, 1 Corinthians, where Paul talks about sacrifice to demons and more defining what pagan worship actually is,
Mm-hmm. Right.
or at least what idols are, and then sacrifice to those idols.
Yeah, the passages in that you're referencing about Paul talking about food sacrificed to idols is a really good one for this discussion, because it kind of uh, see, the thing is, when you're trying to find this out in the Bible and you're looking up pagan things or practices in the way that we talk about it, you won't find a specific Bible scripture defining something like this, but you
Hmm.
will find events, parallel situations, stuff like that, and what the uh, I guess perspective was on those type of events or
Mm-hmm.
practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think that when you look at at least the Torah times, the sort of civic structure that the Torah was attempting to establish, you had essentially Gentiles, foreigners dwelling in the land, and Jews or Israelites. And there seemed to be, for the foreigners, a bit more of a, let's say, latitude in their practice. The scripture doesn't actually explain what that latitude is. It talks about, for instance, when there's going to be the same law for the foreigners and for the native, but at the same time, the foreigner actually does not have all the same rights. He doesn't have the same level of citizenship in Israel, and he has some things that he can get away with, like eating roadkill, for instance.
Right.
And
Good.
he's unable to fully participate in the worship of God, meaning like Passover. He's not able to participate in Passover. So I'm not entirely sure what exactly the foreigner is allowed to get away with in terms of worship himself. I do know that Naaman, for instance, went into the temple in support of his king, but as the story goes, sprinkled dirt on the ground so that the God in heaven would know that he's actually worshiping him and not whatever the idol is.
Mm-hmm.
And so it seems like there is a bit of latitude there in that respect for certain peoples, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. But when you're talking about the foreigner in the Bible, would that be relevant to a believer today? Like would a believer even be a foreigner?
I think in my model of how Scripture has sort of, how the New Testament has sort of been propped on top of the Old one, the distinction between the circumcised in the heart only and the circumcised in the flesh and the heart would be that distinction, because when let's say you read Exodus 12, it says that if a foreigner gets circumcised, then they can be considered a native-born Israelite, and so circumcision really is that key point there.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say that today and in the New Testament, there is that distinction still. Although all are one body in Christ, all are one spirit, in the physical, there is still a bit of a distinction. And that would be between what the Old Testament would call the foreigner and the native-born.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't think I'm going to choose a too strong of a definition. I would throw a couple things out there. Um, for the Israelites, I feel like when it talks about the foreigner, um, they and the Passover example is a good one. They are able to worship God in many different ways, like going to the temple. There's a place for the Gentiles there as well. But then again, they are able to then convert at any point in time and worship God fully.
Mm-hmm.
So partake in Passover, you can do it. The stranger can do it. They just need to be circumcised before, and then they can participate. And essentially, that circumcision would be considered that part of the being part of God's people. You're no longer a foreigner at that point. You're already part of God's people.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were many foreigners that would dwell in Israel. They just wouldn't be a citizen, just like there's many people that are coming here, foreign exchange students, and whatnot in America, but they're not considered full citizens.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's the same with a Christian believer. I think that a Christian believer would be considered completely, fully part of Israel. Not to replace Israel, because there's a Israel by circumcision, by blood, by I guess the inheritance, and that is a real thing in Scripture. Even if you don't believe in God, but you made a covenant with God, God will hold you to that covenant, because your parents made that covenant with Him. Um, but for a believer, I do think that they occupy that position of a circumcised foreigner rather than just a person dwelling in Israel at that time. Um, and I would take it one step further, just to explain why there's a difference. Like you mentioned, the dropping of the earth that one guy did. I forget his name, in the temple to show that he's actually worshiping God.
Naaman.
Yes. So I think that has to do with not them having more permissions per se, but them being judged by how much they.
I wouldn't say permissions. I would say latitude. God sort of gives him. They're essentially ignorant of how bad that practice is, and so God says, "Okay, well, you're trying, and the prophet didn't, give you all the information, probably for a good reason. So you're in. You're just, weird,
Okay. No, I get it. So I guess we're on the same page there. It has to do with how much you know, and you're judged by how much you know. I think that's important, because most people, they don't know everything, or they've been taught it wrong.
Yeah.
If you're a Jew and you've been taught all your life that Jesus is a person who breaks Torah and doesn't regard God's commandments as something that's to be kept from the Old Testament, then you reject that Yeshua. You're not rejecting Yeshua. You're rejecting or Jesus. You're not rejecting Jesus. You're rejecting an image that was given to you that's incorrect. So that particular image, rejecting it, would be consistent, and nothing wrong with that. But rejecting an accurate image of Jesus when it's displayed to them, when it's explained to them, that's different. That is wrong.
Yeah. I would say that, like, one example we could give from Scripture is in Acts 28, when Paul reasons with the Jews for 2 years before he finally says, okay, you guys are hard-hearted. The point being, he really wanted to make sure that they, at least this is how I interpret it, he really wanted to make sure that they understood what they were rejecting before he just wrote them off.
Yeah, exactly the way that I would say it. I think that's I agree with that wholeheartedly. So, with that said, back to the paganism, would it matter biblically if there is something that used to be pagan or that's derived from pagan roots, and it is a specific pagan practice, and Christians were to incorporate that as part of their way of honoring God?
So my answer from the last episode is the same, that it depends on the practice itself, if it's a bad practice. Like, if the pagans give charity on one particular day, and then we decide also to give charity on that day, I don't think God's up there being like, evil. I think he's more saying, well, that's a good thing. You should have been giving charity on that day anyway, just to put them to shame at the very least. But when it comes to, let's say, practices that are associated with more wicked practices, then somewhere in between innocuous and wicked, I would say, is where the line gets drawn.
Okay. So what would the phrase "be separate from the world" mean biblically, do you think?
I think though that generally has to do with holiness. So be separate from the world in heart, mind, and actions. Like where tzitzit, for instance, that's one sign of outward holiness, which is what we're supposed to do. Follow the commandments would be more of the heart, like have your heart directed towards God and not towards yourself. that's separate from the world. And I think when John talks about that specifically, he's referring to love, and so that's the specific commandment that he is referring to, if I'm understanding the citation right. And then in terms of, well, I guess those would be the big things: obedience to the commandments, and especially the holiness commandments.
Okay. Got it. Do you think there is a principle of being separate or to be distinguished as a people in practices and customs?
Yeah, I would say, well, I think that would fall under what I just said.
That first point, like tzitzit, for example.
Yeah, tzitzit, beard growing, no tattoos, stuff like that,
Beard growing.
Yeah.
What about that one? Tell me, expand on that one. I mean, we both have a beard, so I guess we're safe to jump into this, but go ahead.
Well, just I think what we have in the Torah, and of course there are multiple interpretations of it, but don't cut the sides of your beard, or don't cut the sides of your beard for the dead, and that sort of stuff. I think that is generally a commandment from God to, just say don't maim yourself, first of all, and also you should have a nice full beard.
Okay. That's an interesting. Yeah, I always understood that one from maim yourself is probably a good way to say it, but it's in the context of doing things for the dead. And what they would do is hurt themselves for the dead. So they would scar themselves, they would cut themselves, they would rip their hair out, whatever, because it was a huge loss that someone would die. And God keeps stressing that, hey, it's not the end. You're not like everybody else where once you're dead, it's over with. That's not how this works, So don't cut yourself. Don't destroy yourself on behalf of a death. That's not how you're going to treat deaths, especially if there's something to look forward to.
Yeah, your body's the temple. But one pushback on that, just more of a case study, when David's delegates were sent to, don't remember what nation. I think it was it was Moab.
Moab?
Yeah, Moab. When they were sent to Moab, the way that they humiliated them was, of course, cut their dress into a mini skirt, and to cut half of their beard, and then after that, David said, "Okay, well, hide yourself, shave the other half of your beard, and then hide yourself until it's fully grown again." And so I think that it was also more of just a principle of shame and honor as well.
No, I agree. There are definitely some cultural aspects, but interesting. I wouldn't go as far as saying that's a commandment for the beard.
We could say hair cutting, because that's something that Paul talks about. Men should have their hair shorter, and women should have their hair longer.
Yeah. The general principle of, having a separation between the sexes and recognizing the dressing is different and stuff like that. Don't wear women's clothing. Men don't wear. And women don't wear men's clothing. Even though back then men wore skirts, and now not anymore. You can't
not
do that.
No more.
They took it. But yeah. Okay. I think that's a good rabbi hole to not go too far down in, but
yeah,
a little discussion.
Generally, holiness, though, in appearance and in our actions and our heart.
Yeah, and there is a sort of cultural separation that you want to have, just to emphasize this is a different nation, a different people, and there was a national interest to that too. Everything you see in the 5 books of Genesis has to do with giving with the birth of a nation. So there are like 5 different necessities that a nation would need in order to be separate from other people. One would be a national homeland, a language, or a not necessarily a language, but more of a cultural understanding and cultural differentiation, different observed holidays, etc., etc.
Yeah, a common history, a common God,
There
common
you go. Yeah,
tradition
common.
and structure.
Hmm. Yep. So there is that part that is important, but it's not. It's kind of hard to pin down. You see it as more of a very solid theme throughout the whole Bible, and not like a single scripture that's able to define it definitively.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess to show my understanding on it, and I won't take a, a diehard stance on it because I love to have it challenged, but um, the way that I understand Christmas and my perspective of it, because I grew up celebrating Christmas, but Christmas was from the very beginning not separate from uh, pagan observances. Whether you believe there was a coincidence or not that it landed on the winter solstice or the understood date of the winter solstice doesn't really matter. It would still have been at that time, and it would have been a time of both celebrations happening or both commemorations happening. Um, so it's not a way of separating. And then to this very day, it's kind of the same thing where Christmas is not a, you know, specifically Christian holiday in any regard. And the whole Santa, reindeer, Christmas tree, all that just solidifies that the prevailing, uh, I, I guess, elements that identify Christmas as separate from other holidays are all have to do with um, pagan practices and images. So at least as it is in modern time. So it's kind of, and that I think that's more or less the way that it's always been with not all the time, but more or less that's the way it's always been with Christmas.
Oh yeah, I mean, I assume that it would be a relatively popular holiday once you add more of the fun aspects to it. But I think that you'd have, again, some sort of the question, I guess, would be: is that an example of a, because modern days, that's we're 2,000 years removed from the supposed distinction from the pagan holiday, and all of those religions don't exist anymore. So would that be an example of Christianity infecting the non-Christian world in that respect with a relatively popular holiday?
Not necessarily, because otherwise all these different pagan practices wouldn't have made its way into it. It's like it's not like they took a bunch of Christian traditions and turned them into pagan. It's the other way around. So it would be more like us borrowing uh, a lot of Christian pagan traditions, the Yule log, eating ham. Well, that's more of Easter, but Christmas trees, the whole, and then all the commercialization of Christmas as well. Those things that the stuff that we know have a more of a pagan origin are definitely many of those things did make their way into Christmas. So it was more like them coming in to um, infiltrate us or influence us.
In what way? In what way is that an influence, though? Because it doesn't seem to be a moral influence,
Because we're
unless we're
borrowing their stuff, they're not borrowing ours.
right. Okay, but like, let's say that you celebrate Christmas in Japan. It's not like we borrowed Japanese culture, but it's more the other way around. Japanese culture borrowed from America, and it's generally assumed to be more of a Christian thing in Japan.
I don't really know how they celebrate Christmas in Japan. Um, so I hope I'm not going to step into this loose-footed. But if Japan would be celebrating Christmas, then yeah, it would be like Japan borrowing, our traditions. But, and I say our traditions, it would be borrowing the Christmas traditions from wherever they originated. But the same holds true whether you move a little bit further or not. They're borrowing all these customs, whether if they're going to be celebrating, putting Christmas trees in their house, or kissing under the
Mistletoe.
They're borrowing those traditions. They're not influencing Japanese traditions on those, in a way.
Right. But you would say that they are, at least in their mind, they're borrowing an American tradition. They're saying, well, this is a cool American holiday, and we're going to appropriate it.
Yeah, they're on the receiving end, not the giving end.
Okay. So, like, we are, let's say, receiving... Well, Christmas has kind of a weird history, at least in terms of America, because we kind of didn't do it originally. We thought that it was a Catholic abomination, and so we decided not to. So, at the very least, we received it from, let's say, Catholicism or a couple other places, which produced our modern Christmas celebration. So we could say that as the Japanese borrowed it from America, we borrowed it from, let's say, Catholicism and commercialization.
Correct. So we're on the receiving end, not the giving end.
Again. So yeah, so it's really where did the Catholics get it from? But right. That's getting into the historical discussion.
Yeah, that's a good historical discussion. But assuming it is, if we were to, because we would have to assume it is for this to kind of make sense for Christmas. I believe it is. I believe that historically, there's a really strong case that there are a bunch of pagan things, and definitely pagan practices are in Christmas, whether or not you believe the date itself is a pagan date. But we would have to kind of assume that it is for us to see whether or not it would matter at all. So to taking the favorable position in my direction that it is, would it matter biblically if these are all borrowed traditions and practices that we're on the receiving end rather than the giving end? We're on the influence side rather than the influencer.
Yeah, I guess that is the question.
Good, that is the question.
Nice. We got to it, finally.
Yeah. So I guess now let's think about this, because there are a number of Bible scriptures that I think would be relevant for the discussion. One that really sparked my interest was Paul's perspective on things sacrificed to idols.
Mm-hmm. Do you have the specific reference?
I don't have the Bible scripture, but I can really quickly pull that up. There's I think a couple places he talks about. But I know the conclusion that he came to. So I'm pulling it up right now. 1 Corinthians chapter 8 talks about it. There's a couple other places. To summarize the position, and then you can correct me if I'm wrong, but basically this is what it came down to. The idols themselves don't have any power. Like, we understand that when people were worshiping idols, it isn't because they have any power or authority. It's just because they're confused and they're worshiping something that is wrong. So the food itself, if it's sacrificed into an idol, doesn't have any power, but there is a concern about perception. And if people see Christians eating food sacrificed unto idols, that could definitely stumble people. So his conclusion on it would be, don't eat, it doesn't really matter if you buy a piece of meat and you accidentally eat it and it turns out it was sacrificed to idols. However, if you do find out that it was sacrificed into idols, then don't eat it. And if it
Mm-hmm.
definitely makes somebody stumble, then don't give an occasion to stumble.
Yeah, yeah, I would agree with that.
So I guess the if you're gonna replace that with Christmas, and then you're gonna think about the same thing, if by that logic, I think if it turns out that more evidence emerges, or you do more study and you find out that Christmas truly is a pagan, borrowed practice that was originally pagan worship, and we took that, then once we come to that knowledge, then we shouldn't celebrate it. But if you don't come to that knowledge, then um, it's not like you're accidentally um, polluting yourself in a way. It's just we want to make that deliberate attempt about being separate and to not give the wrong image. So um, if it is perceived to have pagan origin, we shouldn't do it. If it isn't, then it's fair game.
Yeah, I guess I would ask what the limits on that are, because I mean, people, let's say Christianity at large right now, thinks that observance to the Mosaic law is, in Paul's mind, like let's say in Colossians, like going back to a form of paganism and idolatry. Like there's obviously limits to that principle.
Of course, but that would be an extreme limit that's limited by Scripture itself and what is commanded.
Mm-hmm.
It's not talking about stuff that's fair game.
Okay.
So this is kind of like a on the border situation. So like, let me think of a way to put this. Well, I guess if it really is perceived to be as a thing of that is pagan, and pagan in the full connotation version, then it shouldn't be by Paul's logic. If Christians understand that it shouldn't be something we incorporate. Like the argument that, oh, so much time has come by that we understand it's pagan, but it doesn't really matter because that's not what we're doing right now. That wouldn't hold because of it's something that influenced and changed our culture rather than us changing their culture. It's that pagan practices and rituals and almost superstitions as well, depending on how you celebrate it, is coming in and changing us, and we would acknowledge that and then say it doesn't matter. Paul would probably say that by his understanding that wouldn't be good as long as it's understood it's pagan.
I would push back a little bit on that, because Paul here's, when he's talking about food sacrificed to idols, he's talking about, later he more fully defines it as food sacrificed to demons. And so when I think you would have to say that in order for this to correlate, that there is actually some sort of demonic force or demonic influence within Christmas worship or Christmas practices. And commercialization aside, I think that is probably, if not demonic, it's entirely secular. But where would you say it correlates to the food sacrifice to idols thing?
So in a way, because Paul says a couple different things, he uses that phrase because there's no such thing as if another god. The Bible specifically says if there is something that we talk about as other gods, they're not really gods.
Mm-hmm.
We're just saying that because it's language and it's what other people call it. So Paul specifies says an idol has no real existence because there isn't any other god. So he talks about that as well. So they're not really worshiping anything, but what they're worshiping is wrong. And you can say that they're influenced by demonic spirits because they're influenced to do things that are wrong. So in a way that if it's worshiping anything, then it's worshiping demons.
Okay.
But if you are going to just take that strict understanding about Christmas, then yeah, for sure. There was the worship of the winter solstice and pagan deities. There was the elves where they come from, a very almost like Halloweenish vibes come from that, demonic. There are those elements. It's very different nowadays.
Yeah, yeah. I agree with that, and I agree on the Santa stuff. Sort of, besides that, if you were to say that, because we're talking ultimately about a pagan influence on a Christian thing or something, what would be, well, I guess what would be the things that are sort of like demonic influences? Because if we're talking about Christmas, we're talking about sort of a mixed bag where you have, like, it's heavily Christian influenced. You might have like specific rituals or movements of the body that are similar, but in terms of the underlying morality of it, what is the moral issue that we're talking about?
Well,
Santa aside, because I understand, that's kind of demigod-ish there.
that's still a little bit ambiguous because I guess it depends on what you're doing. So if you're celebrating Christmas as the birth of Christ by doing a Bible study, okay, you're doing a Bible study. That's a weird way to celebrate Christmas, but there's nothing wrong with a Bible study. But if you're honoring, the specific day, maybe that would be something not very wise to do when all the other pagans are honoring that same day. Maybe, but that's more of a gray area. Now, if you're doing something like putting Christmas trees in your house, and well, actually, let's just stop right there. Christmas trees. Most people that don't, keep all the Santa stuff and everything else, they're still doing other stuff like Christmas trees and other practices which stem back from pagan worship things. So I don't know. What's your view on that?
I think pagans don't have a monopoly on trees, and it's one of those things that
They don't, but they do have a specific thing about taking a tree, decorating it a certain way, putting presents under that tree, and then commemorating a holiday using that as an evergreen specific tree. It's not like it's just a tree. They're not putting apple trees in houses during Christmas. They're not.
Yeah. Are you talking about the Jeremiah passage, or are you talking about something that is more modern or more recent?
No. Well, Christmas trees themselves, they do come from a pagan origin.
Which one though? I guess I'm asking what's the pagan origin of Christmas trees that you're referring to? Because I've heard a variety of different origin stories, prequels.
So I know there's a number of them. It didn't really hear that there's much debate that inevitably it's one of these pagan traditions that most likely influenced the Christmas trees. The Jeremiah passage is not that. The Jeremiah passage may have talked about a religion that could have morphed into another pagan tradition that would have morphed into the Christmas tree. That is very possible. 119 Ministries talks about this. Does a pretty interesting presentation on it. I'm not a Christmas tree expert, but most of the traditions that I've seen indicate that there is some sort of pagan origin for the Christmas tree.
I guess I'm asking because, like, let's say you go to the Germanic tribes and, before Christianity came in, and you have this story of this Catholic saint chopping down the tree to Thor, and everyone thought he was going to be struck down, and he wasn't, and so everyone was amazed, and they started worshiping the true God instead. or you have, let's say, the Asherah tree, like much more ancient. You have trees being generally in. I don't want to say ubiquitous, but you have like trees are a common form of or a common place of worship in pagan cultures because they are seen as sort of like the gifts of the gods or gifts from the gods, and at the same time some sort of representative of the gods. So like the Egyptian hieroglyphs that have Isis like literally inside of a tree that was never carved into any sort of idol. They saw the trees as an idol itself. So it seems to me, at the very least, that trees were seen as kind of, let's say, slightly closer to the divine, sort of like high hills. But at the same time...
But what about the use of evergreen trees on the winter solstice specifically?
I don't know enough about like evergreen specifically.
Yeah, everything I read said that it's not much of a debate, this particular subject. Like, I mean, if you just Google it, it would say pagans in Europe use branches and evergreen fir trees to decorate their homes and brighten their spirits during the winter solstice. And then there's Romans using the evergreen to decorate their temples at the festival of Saturnalia, specifically, you know, on the winter solstice, them doing it that way. But I guess the question, for the sake of this particular discussion, is, let's say it does have a pagan origin. Would it matter?
Okay, so I guess I would think that if it did, the question would be, what is the object of worship? Because putting up a tree in your house, what's the difference between that and putting up an ornate bush? For instance, like you have the Hanukkah bush, or you have just the general...
We're calling it the Hanukkah bush.
Or you just have the general, you are much more of a nature-y sort of person. I know one person who put a palm tree in her bathroom, for instance. Like, what's the difference between the pagan thing and the actual just practice of it?
Well, I mean, it's relatively specific practice. You know, like the difference between dancing for worship and then doing a ritual dance that was once used for pagan worship.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a clear difference there. Mm-hmm. Or, you know, it's like it's very specific. We're not talking about putting a palm tree. I have a palm tree right here in this room. It's not pagan. I love trees, and trees are fantastic. It produces oxygen and everything else. It keeps our sanity.
I'm good. I'm glad you like trees. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Everybody likes trees. Bible likes trees. Bible says don't cut down trees. But
so I guess the question is, what makes it pagan today? The modern Christian who puts up a Christmas tree, he sees it as more of a metaphor for Christ, from my understanding.
He's using that as a sort of a dedication to Christ.
Yeah. Like if you listen to sermons around Christmas, they'll always be like, yeah, the Christmas tree, it's an evergreen tree because it doesn't die in the winter. And Christ, having been someone who went down to the pits of death, conquered death. And so the Christmas tree, having conquered the winter, is like Christ having conquered death.
That is a very modern explanation.
Yeah, but it's relevant because it's relevant because that's what Christians view it as.
That's one way that they can explain it, or, you know, change it. But so here's how I see it. The Christmas trees actually is a really good test case. But the use of an evergreen tree on the winter solstice, that goes back, well documented practice, specifically as a pagan thing, often associated with worshiping pagan deities or superstitions, spirits. It's a faith element. That particular thing, if it was used during that time for Saturnalia or for, you know, other pagan practices, and all of a sudden a Christian says, "Oh, that's cool. I'm going to put up a tree to dedicate to Yahweh in the very same way the pagans do it." Would it be wrong for them to do it at that time?
Well,
And the answer would
I
be,
think that I mean, Christians didn't do that originally, though. That's a very modern practice. Yeah,
trees.
yeah, it's recent. It's
Well,
like post Middle
it's got to
Ages.
go back to Germany at least, right? I think the earliest times when they were using it.
Yeah, I believe. But then you have to ask, okay,
But at that time,
was
it
it
was still
was it
very,
traditionally a
uh-huh.
German pagan practice? Because if they just,
No, no, goes way back.
I mean, for when they adopted the Germanic practice, was it a German pagan practice when they did that?
It wasn't a German pagan practice because it goes a lot further back, but it was a pagan practice. So what I'm saying is that there was some sort of transition point where, because it was always used for pagan worship, and there's a sort of transition point where all of a sudden it's a Christian thing. It's a very specific thing that's on a winter solstice, one day a year. This is what you do. This is how you do it, and suddenly it becomes a Christian practice. At one point where there's this transition, there are some people who knew where this came from. For them, would it be wrong to have adopted that practice as a dedication for God? Specifically taking something the way that the pagans worshipped and then all of a sudden dedicating it to God. Would have been wrong
I
for
think
them to
again
do
it
that.
depends on the practice. So if we're yeah,
Well, the
I
tree.
think my rule of thumb is if it's ubiquitous in pagan culture, it's probably not that. It's more of an issue of could you what?
Say
It's
it.
more of an issue
Say
of
it.
could you have come up with that idea independent of pagan stuff, and when we this is in psychology, this is the test of creativity. You give a bunch of people a brick and you say how many uses for a brick can you come up with, and the least creative people all come up with brick wall. Like everyone says brick wall. And so extrapolating that outwards, if everybody is using one specific thing for a specific purpose and they're all independent of each other, they didn't all grow out of one tradition. The assumption is that it's less that they were developing it from those traditions and more that that is something that we sort of just associate with that particular practice. Like trees are associated with worship in the human heart. And so that would be more, I guess, my reservation on that issue. It's if pagans everywhere had this practice independently of each other, then maybe it's not exactly a pagan practice, maybe it's just a human practice.
Okay, human practice. Name another holiday out of the year where people take a tree and put it into their houses and then decorate it and then
Another
put
holiday?
gifts under it. Yeah, any other holiday.
Can't think of one.
It's a
Well, you
ubiquitous
said
human
that pagans
practice.
everywhere observed this in a specific way, and so what you were telling me, in my mind, was it's ubiquitous.
No, no. I'm saying it was universally accepted as a pagan practice among
What's
pagans.
the difference?
So, you know, there's a big difference because I'm not talking about pagans as Gentiles. I'm talking pagans about people celebrating uh, faiths that are, you know, very specific in nature. So if there was, it's an element that you can definitely specify as a religious aspect. So, if kissing under a mistletoe, it's not something that you would normally do. It's not a human practice. It is a pagan worship practice. So a Christmas tree thing is not a general human behavior type of thing. It is a specific pagan practice that was
I guess,
recycled because no other day out of the year do we do
yeah,
this.
I guess I would need to look more into that specific part, the Christmas tree. But let's say moving on to a different practice in Christmas. is it wrong to give gifts?
Well, let's before we jump to that, just so we understand, moving ambiguity aside, if it is definitely a pagan practice, would that, by your understanding, recycling that and dedicating it
I
to
think
Yahweh
maybe
be wrong?
initially, but once it has been established as a Christian tradition, it's now a Christian tradition. Like the it once it's recycled, the next generation that believes it's a Christian tradition and not a pagan tradition, to them it's a Christian tradition and it's not a pagan tradition.
What if the generation after that finds out that this is a recycled pagan tradition?
I think that, yeah, I think that it's
And everybody
still a Christian tradition at that point. Because, yeah, it may have been a pagan tradition two generations ago, but 2 generations later, it's not.
This is exactly where the whole debate comes down to. This exactly a judgment right here, because for many Christians that don't celebrate Christmas, this is a problem point because they're like, well, if we know it's pagan and it was dedicated to pagan deities, and there's that Deuteronomy chapter 12 passage saying, you shall not look and see how pagans worship me and then recycle their traditions to worship me. You should not do that. They take that and say, okay, that's good enough for me to not worship, but other people will say, you know what, I'm doing it differently. It comes down to my heart. So you're from the very beginning, when we first got into the movement, that was always the defense for Christmas. Nothing changed there. Like that was always their defense as their bottom line. But we didn't really agree with that because we said that, worship does have perimeters. It does have, a certain way of doing it. It's not like all encompassing. There is a certain way that there are like some limitations to it. And you just saying God knows my heart, it doesn't work that way. God intentions and outcomes are not all the same. Eating pork and doing it out of the greatest attention isn't healthy for you. So what changed in your understanding? Or because before you did have a different stance where it wasn't okay if they were recycled pagan traditions and everybody found out that. Like, what changed in your stance there?
Because when we're talking about, let's say, the food sacrifice to idols thing, you're talking about something that's a current, it's well understood that you're sacrificing to an idol. I think it's a pretty fringe group of people who are saying that Christians who put a Christmas tree up are sacrificing to Tammuz. I think that's just not how people understand it, and especially Christians who, I think Michael brought up the statistic, 94% of Christians celebrate Christmas. It's by and large a Christian thing, not necessarily a pagan thing. And then even as Protestants who eventually adopted it in America, we saw it as a Catholic thing. Now, say what you want about Catholics, they're at least the original Christians. And so if we assume that the Catholics got it from the pagans, then we're talking about, like, first of all, 2,000 years of development from the supposed original pagan origins. And traditions do evolve over time. That's one of the whole points of traditions. And
yeah, but at the same time, like, not only like the same statistics are true for unbelievers,
right,
and their
but they call it a winter holiday. Happy holidays. I think that's that's a big point, because there was that push to remove Christ from Christmas more recently, because it's too Christian. And I think that's relevant. I think that's important.
You know why they're trying to remove Christ from Christmas? It's so funny, like these arguments on both sides. Like, they're saying because it's a pagan holiday and they stole it. Many atheists will actually you listen to their arguments on it. It's so funny. And then the other thing is that they would say, It may have been a Christmas holiday before, but now it's not. It's clearly not a Christmas holiday. Everybody's doing it. So let's not, make it a specifically a Christmas holiday, kind of like
Mm-hmm.
flipping that around. But I guess none of this is new. Like that, our understanding, coming in was exactly that it was a pagan holiday, recycled pagan worship practices, and then all of a sudden a bunch of Christians are doing it, and now Christians are saying it's okay because God knows my heart. Somehow that wasn't a good explanation for us, but now it's a really good explanation.
I think that it's
So what
different
changed?
than being a pagan holiday because it's a Christian holiday. For it's been one for 1800 years, and so at what point in the course of history do you sort of say, okay, it has transitioned from traditionally a pagan holiday, giving the supposed adoption from Christians? At what point does it actually transition? Is it always pagan, or is there ever a transition point?
I think it has to be always pagan if we know that it's pagan and it's recycled. Because the reason I say that is because it can go the other way. If suddenly now you're taking it into the point where whatever it is now culturally accepted as that's the new norm, then that's a problem because now culturally Christmas is not considered a uniquely Christian holiday at all. It is just as much as a Gentile holiday as it is a Christian holiday. So if you're going to take that argument that it is what it is currently, and that's what makes it okay, then it falls apart because now we have to switch again because the cultural norms have changed. It's no longer just a Christian holiday.
I think,
Should culture really dictate that
yeah,
anyways? Waves of culture,
I think there in the Bible
moods of
there are a
culture.
variety of commands that are entirely cultural dependent. So, like in the New Testament, the word for
Okay.
okay,
Wait, no,
so
I agree.
okay,
No
and
need to prove.
um, what when we talk about, let's say, there is one instance, I think it's in Jeremiah, where God talks to the people of Israel and he says that you do things that even the pagans blush at, or even the Canaanites blush at. He's saying that there is an element of the pagans. Actually, that's not a good point, so I'm not going to make it.
Well, yeah, because here's the thing. Because now the argument would be that it is no longer a uniquely Christian holiday, and by that extension, it's a worldly
I'd say
holiday.
that's a triumph of Christianity.
Okay, them borrowing a worldly holiday and then making it considered a Christian holiday, and then losing that title again and it coming back to a worldly holiday. I would say that's lost
Why is
ground,
it lost
at least
ground though?
in a positive, because it was a mm, uh, secular holiday,
Mm-hmm.
at least. I would argue probably a pagan holiday, but let's just say secular holiday to begin with. Then it became more Christian, and then now we're back to a secular holiday. So we moved backwards, not forward.
But what do you do on Christmas? So we're talking about the Christmas tree. There's also gift giving. There's a general. It's a general. You watch Christmas movies. It's about like family and giving and stuff like that. I'd say that because those are all good things, then it's a triumph of goodness, and because God is good, He's the author of all good. Then it is a triumph of God, not of secularism. I'd say it's a good thing when God infects
Well, I
secular
mean,
minds.
but the most popular elements of Christmas, the way that you would identify Christmas, they're not Christian practices.
Are they good practices?
I don't know. Sticking a tree in your house is neither good nor bad, just as an act. Or Santa Claus, neither good nor
Mm-hmm.
bad, just as a figure. um, reindeer, elves, all those just as elements in of itself, but taking it all together and maybe the fact of like Santa Claus not being real, just there to control children's behavior. That's a real gray area
Well, what
to say
about
whether or
gift
not it's good
giving?
or bad.
Is that good or bad?
No, gift giving is like something almost universal on
Okay,
any
but
event.
is it good? What about
Sure.
the what was it? The let's say
Look. Just because a specific act is good doesn't mean that the practice itself is good. Like the worship of often using groves, tree groves to worship deities. Planting
mm-hmm,
trees is good. It doesn't mean the groves were good. No, they had to destroy those groves because
mm-hmm.
they were dedicated to idols. They were used to idols. They could have easily said, no, now this is not what it actually means. And in a generation, this will be perfectly okay.
They could have. Yeah, that's true.
But they did not. And
Mm-hmm,
God said,
mm-hmm.
don't do that.
So that wasn't though. Let's say 2,000 years after the fact. They didn't stumble upon a grove and be like, oh, this seems to have been a pagan practice. They had a recent collective consciousness of this being a grove and a severe possibility and probability that if they kept it, then it would be a temptation for everybody to return to Baal worship, for instance.
Possibly, but that's not what that not I wouldn't say it's too severe. I mean, it was so common practice for any conquering nation to recycle the monumental sites and to rename them and to make them
Yeah,
their
yeah.
own. And it wasn't the fear of, them losing their culture. It was actually cultural. It was different. It was them sort of like uh
But they were also polytheists. They didn't have a problem with adding more gods to the pantheon.
sure. Yeah, that's true. But still, like it wasn't a fear of them. Yeah, no, they wouldn't really worry if suddenly Yahweh kind of comes into it because they're not afraid of pollution. They're not worried about that. God does have a concern about polluting, faith. So the concern is really
Mm-hmm.
one-sided.
So then, what is the pollution? Who's the other god that's coming in?
The pollution doesn't have to
Well,
necessarily be a god.
those
It's
groves
how you worship
were
God.
dedicated to a particular god, and I agree. There is an element of how you worship God that needs to be distinguished. I think the main question that I have, and this is where it gets back to where the line is drawn, is do we distinguish the worship practices at the line between good and innocuous or between innocuous and bad? And so I would say that if what you just said, giving gifts is just generally a thing that you do on holidays, but giving gifts is a good thing. So is it wrong to worship God by giving gifts to other people? And I think that you would agree that it's not wrong to do that. But when we're talking about, let's say, the innocuous things like the Christmas tree, like all that other stuff, you would say that that's wrong. And I would say that the innocuous things are not wrong, I don't think, at least not in and of themselves. They have to be associated with something a bit more malevolent. But then we would both agree that the bad things are bad. So
Yeah, yeah, and just as a wisdom thing. So now we're just talking about a wisdom from a wisdom perspective. There is a general theme about being separate from the world that the Bible talks about having a different culture, in a sense. And more, it's not talking about just looking differently necessarily, although there's a small aspect to that as well. It's the religious faith aspect being different from the world, having your religion not being polluted in a way. I do think that that is relevant, not to say, oh, that's a cool way that they worship their gods. Let's make that into a Christian thing. Let's make that into a Jewish thing. I think there is a strong theme saying don't do that. That's not good, because the way that you worship a god inevitably is going to affect the identity of that god. That's almost linked together. Our way of worshiping and understanding, honoring God, are linked with the identity and the basic tenets of faith. So, although I have nothing wrong with, I have no quarrels with giving gifts or some of these other practices. When it comes to now in our time, when we find out that a lot of these are pagan practices, and it's very likely that even the date, there was just a contention on the date. Even the date is a Christmas, is a pagan date with the winter solstice. Like, if there really is a concern, and you look it up, most people who don't even believe in God would acknowledge that there's pagan origins with Christians. In our day and age, when we have that knowledge, I think that Paul's conclusion would be, you know it, now you know, separate it. Don't worry about it. If you didn't know, it's not like you lost your salvation. But now you know better. Don't give the impression that it's okay to incorporate pagan things, because the explanation that we'll do whatever we want to do and then God will know our heart, I don't think that that's ever been a strong standing point.
Okay. So,
and think about all the good things about all the biblical holidays, like that's the other argument on it, is that you can replace things with holidays where every single thing, and anybody who's actually worshipped a biblical holiday knows this, every single thing. You go through every single tradition, and suddenly there's a teaching on how that's, a symbolism, a biblical thing that reinforces your faith. That's not the same with Christmas. Christmas does not have that aspect where it really is a step-by-step, all-encompassing reinforcement of faith.
I think it depends on how you do it, because Christmas is universally adopted by many cultures around the world. It sort of gets muddied, like you were talking about. But that does get into, well, it doesn't really. I think my perspective on it, like regardless of the whole discussion that we're having right now, is actually a little different. I think that the more weight is placed on unity of the body of Christ and, let's say, obedience to the human authorities that God has put over us. I think, and this, let's say, is...
That's a very Catholic.
I think it's a New Testament position,
actually,
and an Old Testament one.
Not really, because I mean, you see in the New Testament a very strong oppositions to authority and rocking the boat when it comes to things that we believe are biblically not clean, and that's kind of the position here with most Christians, that they have a biblical concern. It's not like this is a different type of concern related to something else. It is a biblical concern. And if it is a biblical concern where this is something that God would have a problem with, they have the absolute right and need to rock the boat and to take a strong stance. Now, to agree with you on unity, I would absolutely go there and hold hands with you on that. But unity is not uniformity, and debates must go on, and people must hold to their convictions. It doesn't mean I should excommunicate, somebody.
Going off of the human authority thing, I have a few verses. The first one would be Exodus 18:17 through 26, and this then would be followed in Deuteronomy 1:13 and 18. and that then evolves in Deuteronomy 17, 8 through 13. So in Exodus 18, of course, it's the story where Moses is judging all the people, and his father-in-law Jethro says, this is wrong, you should delegate to judges below you. And what happens is he delegates to, he sets judges over tens, 50s, and thousands. And then all of the hard matters are brought to Moses. Then you have Deuteronomy 1, 13 through 18, where he talks about the same story, except in this instance he says, you elect these people, and I will set them over you. So there's a bit more information that's given. Deuteronomy 17, 8 through 13 actually has a different take on it entirely. Moses says, any of the hard matters that are going to be coming to you, bring to the Levite and the judge that's over you at the time. And there's sort of an understanding that Moses at one point was, let's say, the top guy. But now that he's about to die, he's passing that along to the Levites and the judge. And you have the Sanhedrin, Exodus 24, 1 through 2, and 9 through 14. Now, regardless of whether or not we think that the Sanhedrin was continually in operation throughout the history of Israel, I think that's irrelevant. It is a biblical thing, and it's an established authority from the Torah, where there were 70 elders from all of the people, and then the high priest, Moses, and his 2 sons that would have become high priests. This is also explained in Numbers 11, 16 through 17, and 24 through 30. And so there's this, we see the judgment system at the very least. You have the high court, which would be the Sanhedrin, and then you have the lower courts, the judges of tens, 50s, and thousands, and then the highest matters would go to the Sanhedrin because the head of the Sanhedrin was Aaron, let's say. So, regardless of whether or not we think that that was continuous throughout biblical history, I do think that in the New Testament era, the Second Temple period, that was a practice, and I think that it was from the Torah, and I think that it was still practiced and relevant. And so we have, for instance, Matthew 23, 3, and you know that one where Jesus says, whatever the Pharisees tell you to do, but don't do what they say, do what they say, but don't do as they do, because they're hypocrites. But we have, in addition to that, I think that is a direct reference to these Sanhedrin practices. We also have Acts 23, 5, where the wicked high priest commands Paul to be slapped, and Paul rebukes him. And then someone says, hey, he's the high priest, and he repents, and he says, for it is written that you shall not speak against a leader of your people. So Paul, in Acts 23, thought of this high priest as a leader of the people with religious authority. So to me, that indicates a continuation of the Sanhedrin for New Testament believers. And so with that as the overarching structure, we have, in addition to that, the lower judges, let's say. For 1 Corinthians 11:1, imitate me as I imitate Christ. 1 Corinthians 11:2, I commend you for obeying all of the traditions that I have passed down to you. Then you have 2 Thessalonians 3:6, says the same thing. And there was one other, but I don't have it written down. But in terms of imitation, we also have 1 Corinthians 4:16, Philippians 3:17, 1 Thessalonians 1:6. And then in Acts 21:21, James talks to Paul, and he says, it has been told to all the Jews who are believers that you tell people, the Jews living out in foreign nations, that they should forsake the law and forsake the customs of our people. And Paul obviously says that's ridiculous. Let me perform a sacrifice to say that that's wrong. Then we have 23:6, which I actually forgot what that one said, but it had to do with the traditions, and 25:8. And then
Yeah, this what you're saying. Sorry to cut you off, but um, I agree with that there's that need for unity, a
Specifically,
need for
obedience to the
consensus
traditions.
based
Yeah.
on religious authority, and there should be a reverence for traditions. Most of our generation don't have a
Mm-hmm.
reverence for tradition, and I don't think that's right. However, there are limitations to all these examples and all these situations. And then, of course, you can find many situations in the Bible where people would deliberately rock the boat. The hand washing example with the Bible, and Jesus didn't have to make a deal out of it, but he did. He made a deal out of that. There's many times where the authorities were challenged based on where there was an understanding of biblical violation, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't respect authority or have a reverence for authority. I do agree that that's anytime there is a challenge to it is a far exception to it rather than the rule. However, in our situation, we don't have a religious authority that is over us, and the majority is
I would
never
say that
the
we do,
religious
though.
authority. It's
Let's say we
never
go back to Christmas. It was established as a Christian holiday when the religious authority was Catholicism. And so I believe that.
Yeah, but they also
Right,
said
right.
that you
And that would
shouldn't
be
keep
wrong
Sabbath.
because they're disobedient to specifically the commandment. But
Okay, yeah, this is exactly where
But
the line is
there's a
drawn.
difference there
Is when there's
because
a
it's
biblical
not
question.
only biblical. We do have instances in the Bible where people would disobey the scripture, let's say, in order to obey a different scripture. So Daniel, when he was talking about the fast of Daniel, the interesting thing that he says there is, I will eat the meat if this test doesn't work. So the idea is there is a human authority over me that tells me to do this wrong thing. And I know that this is a lower commandment, so I will gladly eat the meat because obedience to the human authorities is a higher commandment than eating meat, let's say. But give me, at least, I beg of you, give me a test here so I can try it out. And maybe you'll learn something too. And I think when we're talking about the hand washing, Jesus actually didn't make a big deal of the hand washing itself. He used that as a springboard to talk about the korban. Yeah, exactly.
Rock the boat.
And I do think that traditions, when they're entirely man-made traditions, I think that they are, it's okay just to not participate. But we also have, let's say...
But I mean, no. The hand washing thing is not just a man-made tradition. That is a tradition of the elders. That's something that was
Mm-hmm.
a religious practice
And,
that was well established, and there's nothing wrong with it. I think
well,
it's a
it's
great tradition.
from the Bible,
So
too. There's a psalm, for instance, where God says, or David says, who's going to go up to the mountain of the Lord, one with a pure heart and clean hands. And when you have the temple worship, everybody had to wash their whole body, and then when they got closer to the temple, they had to wash their hands and stuff. And so it was actually an established practice. It was just more universalized in the first century by the elders, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah, so there wasn't really a need to rock the boat for him. But the reason he did was because they were using that to neglect something more biblically important.
well,
And so,
they yeah,
I
yeah,
agree with authority.
but
Majority is not authority.
right. But the establishment of Purim, for instance, it was an entirely man-made festival, and what it says is it gives it that sort of weight of authority, saying that because the Jews in those days established this as a festival, it is now a festival for all generations. And because I think that this is directly relevant to Christmas, because Christmas was established as a holiday when Christianity was entirely unified, when there was some sort of judgment.
That's not true that they're entirely
The unified part of Christianity. It was established by what was seen as a recognized authority. And I do think that, let's say, pastors, priests, that whole hierarchy and that structure is a continuation of the system of the judges, not a continuation of the system of the priests, obviously, because those are reserved for the Levites. But if the Torah does say that you are to establish these judges over you, you're to elect them, and also that God will establish them, and we continue to do that, I think that that is an actual authority over us. Now, for us as Protestant-leaning people, I think that we should probably pay more attention to our local pastors. What do they say? And be unified to our local congregations. But I think that it's also important to be unified to, let's say, Christianity at large. Yeah.
But that's majority again. And no, that establishment of Christianity as a religion by the emperor of Rome, who was very questionable in his own practices, by the way. But again, there are limitations. Even that counsel, even that understanding, I would have great respect for, and I do, except when it comes to biblically questionable things. Like, that's always the drawing line. So right now, that's exactly what we're talking about. If there's a biblical question where, hey, this is not kosher, then you don't have to swap your brain out. The Bible says that call no man rabbi, rabbi, in that regard, that he's going to make an ultimate authority on your moral compass. There are definitely authorities and figures and issues of ambiguity that religious authority settles out, and there's a need for consensus. But that council, established by a very powerful, questionable dude, is not biblically consistent as a biblical authority, where in the very same time he made Shabbat no longer a relevant commandment. That's not something the Sanhedrin would do. That's not something that a religious judge would do.
Well,
that
Shabbat
would
is more
by.
of one of the weighty commandments, though. It's one of the 10, first of all. And second of all...
Not by the council, not by the majority
of
Christians nowadays.
But it is one of the weighty commandments. When we're talking about Christmas, for instance, we're not talking about Shabbat. We're talking about, I think, one of the lesser, it is essentially at the level of obedience to, let's say, the consensus. And that also is a New Testament thing. I didn't put it in here, but 1 Corinthians 11:28, I believe, or no, 14:28 and 11:11. Paul makes two, let's say, what's it called? Appeal to consensus, church consensus. He says, in terms of women wearing their head covering and men not wearing a head covering, he says, this is done in all the churches, therefore you should do it. And then when it comes to women teaching, in 14, he says, I don't tell you to do this, the law doesn't tell you to do this, it's not natural for it to do this, and we have no practice like this in all of the church. And so there is an appeal by Paul to church consensus here and there, at the very least.
Yeah, but those aren't biblical, questionable issues, Again, that's always the line. Always draw the line. I mean, you would agree that if something's biblically questionable and a religious council violates that, you wouldn't adhere to their counsel.
I think that the Bible establishes authority over us at the same time. Now, if it's a weighty matter of the law, then yeah, you'd have to reject it. And so going back to Daniel, the eating foods either that are unkosher or sacrificed to idols or whatever that was, that's one instance. But then when you talk about bowing down to the idol of Nebuchadnezzar, that was just a flat no. And so when it comes to weighty matters of the law, we just need to flatly disregard it. And I think early Christians were doing that, let's say, in terms of the justice they were seeking for infants, let's say, who were exposed. Just despite what the law says, they went out and brought those infants back in and established orphanages and stuff like that. Or like what Paul was talking about in Philemon, taking a slave, Onesimus, and against the law of the Romans, giving him some safe haven and commanding the master Philemon to set him free. So these would be things against Roman authority, but they are seen as weighty commandments. And so I think it's the same thing with Christmas. Christmas, I think, is one of the lower commandments. And so it's highly dependent on local custom and, let's say, universal custom.
Yeah, I guess maybe that's a good point to good point to point out, because I do think that it is more of a weightier issue for because it has to do with worshiping God, a certain way. To recycle pagan traditions to worship God in those pagan ways, I don't think that's trivial. But I also, again, do think that there is an interest in us saying that it does matter, because, many people that do ended up keeping biblical traditions, it was specifically through this medium, finding out that these other traditions were pagan. And that was their gateway. That was their way of learning to keep Torah, learning to keep Sukkot. They're learning to keep Passover.
Isn't that a bit
for the
of
first time in their lives.
That's a, what's it called? There's a statistical error there. It's bias for the believer or something like that. It's a sample bias. You have a particular sample of people who have separated themselves from Christian traditions, and they all say that they separated themselves from Christian traditions because of this one thing, which is one thing, but what's your sample of Christians who have rejected Messianicism for one reason or another? What do they say? And I'm assuming they give a lot of answers. First of all, probably they don't want to obey the law. But one thing that I've seen is a lot of this Christmas stuff it smells bad to a lot of Christians. And so when we talk about, when we make a big point or a big deal of Christmas, it actually seems, from my experience and from what I've seen being in the Christian world for a while now, is it seems to push people away from assuming that we have any sort of sense on the matter of biblical stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, because most of the time I see it coming down to presentation. Because if a person says, you're pagan, you're going to hell, you're worshiping Christmas, of course that's a turn off. But so many people would be like, it is pagan, it's got pagan roots. There are just better celebrations, and I don't know. I guess that's an interesting point to end this on, because it kind of comes down to, it's a long discussion for sure. But I guess my values and perspective on all of this is that authority matters, but there are limits to authority.
And I agree with that.
To religious authority. It'll be biblical grounds. I think we do have an interest as Messianics to say that holidays matter, and to point out the pagan origins of certain religions, as to show that they're inferior, to religious holidays, and to encourage people to switch over. I don't think we should crucify people for celebrating Christmas. I think that a lot of basic tenets of it are good, like giving gifts, being jolly and kind to one another, and there's nothing wrong with honoring God on any day, but to recycle this specific problem of it being a recycled pagan tradition with a bunch of pagan practices, that is, I believe, problematic and not preferable. As a biblical wisdom preference thing, I think we could probably agree that that's not the
I would say
best
it
thing.
definitely downgrades it
Um,
from, let's say, a holiday that would have been entirely free from those traditions. But I would also add to what you just said that I think the biblically established or the divinely established holidays, of course, are much better than even Purim and Hanukkah, and so which are human but also, still good. So there is an order of goodness there.
okay, so I guess maybe we do have an agreement, a common ground after all of this. Maybe there is a common ground. So let me see if I can phrase this in a way that would be palatable. So, would you agree? We would agree that biblical
Yeah,
holidays are
yeah.
definitely better. We would agree that it can be helpful sometimes for Christians to know that there are questionable origins to a lot of what they do in like Christmas and maybe
Oh yeah,
Easter, definitely Halloween and all those. They should know
yeah.
about some
As
of
so
those
long as
concerns.
they're true, I do think that
And some of
there's
those,
I can't emphasize more the importance of actual historical data on that sort of stuff. But yeah, if there's like
right.
Halloween, for instance, if it's or Easter Bunny, let's say, if it's actually just like straight up from in terms of the historical data from a pagan source, then yeah, I think yeah. So continue what you were saying.
Yeah. And for Christmas specifically, it could be helpful to point out that there are still some questionable things, at least with this faith, with the faith, with the practices. But at the same time, we agree that we shouldn't crucify Christians for celebrating Christmas. We agree there's a lot has to do with presenting this the right way and shouldn't bash people over the
Mm-hmm.
head, especially right before Christmas, which is kind of interesting timing of this. But with no intention to throw this at somebody to crush them in a debate, but uh,
Yeah,
right
I
before
know.
Christmas. But anyways, so,
Happy
so
Hanukkah, by
we
the
agree
way.
with the presentation thing. Thank you. And then let's see, what else do we agree on? What else can you think of?
I think that's pretty much it. We want to holiness. We agree that we want to be holy and set apart from the world as much as is reasonable.
Yeah, and we agree that religious authority is important, but we do believe
Mm-hmm.
there are certain limitations to it when it comes to biblically questionable things, and that can
Mm-hmm.
be further defined, etc. But we agree that the general value of tradition with limitations. So I think, we're kind of on the same page for the most part. And probably if we're talking to somebody about Christmas, most of the same stuff we would say. Um, but we would, whether or not we'd go to a Christmas party
Yeah,
is
yeah.
a different tactic. And I think that's good. That's good that we're mostly on the same page with
Me too.
everything.
I agree. I agree with that. Um, yeah, I think the only thing where we differ is if your local authority says, or let's say your local congregation that you attend because you have elected those leaders by the fact of your attendance, does do some sort of Christmas thing, then I would probably say that it is biblically a biblical duty to actually participate, insofar as they're not doing the pagan stuff. And then I would assume that if that you would say that if your local authority, your local church is, or the one that you attend, is doing something like that, then you would say, well, you don't have to attend. It's not something that, or you have the ability to just separate yourself from it.
I would actually say that it's okay to do it unless they're doing pagan stuff. And since it's all pagan, then don't do it.
Mm.
That's my perspective. Very
Mm-hmm.
respectfully, very respectfully. Honestly, I would not like make it, hell or anything like that. In the most respectful way,
Mm-hmm.
decline.
Because they're not going to hell, in all honesty. I know some Messianics, they say that, yeah, it's a pagan holiday and you're worshiping a pagan god in your participation, and therefore you're not worshiping Christ, and therefore you are losing your salvation through it. And I think that that is just ridiculous. I think, it's just, that's not true.
Yeah, it isn't true. It for a large part is a wisdom thing based off of biblical guidelines and biblical customs, but still, it is a question that needs to be investigated because of the possibility of actually violating Scripture by doing it.
Yeah.
So definitely something that we should hammer out. We should go back and forth, ping pong on it, as much as possible, do more digging, whatever we can, and then just encourage people to transition. And maybe the new consensus will be let's keep the other holidays. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
for the most part, I think we're almost exactly the same, very similar. So
Yeah, I
that's
would say that we're very similar as well.
good.
Good,
Good.
good point of unity.
There's the unity.
Yeah.
Good, good. Okay, well, this was a great discussion. I think we definitely did make some progress despite going back and forth a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and that's inevitable with any discussion. But um, people will largely come to their own conclusion, just based on their level of understanding, and God will just judge them based on their level of understanding always.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so we have to be patient with people with where they're at, uh, either me with you or you with me, and let God decide. But um, I'm more than honored to have you as a brother and to be able to have these sort of discussions. It's such a godly and honorable thing, and
I
it's
agree.
a
I
lot of
agree.
fun.
I actually remember the prayer that I attempted to say last week.
Oh, good.
Matovu ohalecha Yaakov Mishkanatecha Yisrael is what I was trying to say.
How wonderful are the tents of Jacob, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
And the dwelling places of Israel.
Yeah.
So, do you want to close us out in prayer?
Sure. Let's do it. Thank you, God, for your abundant care and patience with us. That you give us a chance to learn and to try to understand your word. Lord, I pray that you continue to give us guidance and desire to dig further into your word. Blessed be your name for all the amazing progress that you've already given to your people through them understanding your scripture through accessibility, and also through just the adaptation of your biblical holidays, again with Passover becoming more popular, and Sukkot and all the other holidays. We thank you for all these wonderful things that you're constantly opening our eyes to, and I pray you help us to run faster and more aggressively toward what is true and what is right. Help us and guide us, Holy Spirit. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you
That
for
was fun.
joining me. Yeah, it really was. Now, really quick, Jesus is Lord?
All the time.
All the time.
That's not the saying.
Yeah, something like that. Well, I don't know. There's this verse in Paul where he says, was it demonic spirits can't say demon is or Jesus is Lord, and
Oh,
so
Jesus is Lord. There you go.
Yeah.
Now we both prove we're not demonic spirits.
Exactly. We're coming from a place of Christ.
There you go. Good.
All
right. You have a good week.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.